I would say that what we just did with the 6-team teaching models is going to be solid gold in terms of anywhere you go, IBEST being done all across the nation. Like, we're all on these 6-team teaching models, and this is really how we look at it and talk about it in the classroom. As we get into the collaborative planning piece, it's going to be a little bit more me saying, here's how we set it up in Washington State, and then work with me to understand how this will make sense in your program and what you need to do to adapt it from a planning perspective. So the planning is roughly divided into kind of 2 parts. The first is to really think about how do you set the class up. So that's syllabus, that's outcomes, that's that type of stuff. Then the second part moves into how do you look at assessments or assignments and assessments from an IBEST lens. So we're going to break it up, kind of syllabus and outcomes, assignments and assessments, and walk through each piece at a time and see where we get. So here's a quote from the very early days of IBEST, and we've kind of kept it around because it's kind of lofty and aspirational and sounds like a good thing to say when you're getting started on this. It says, the process requires reflection, a stretch of your pedagogical muscles, if you will, a willingness to think in new ways and take risks, and an appreciation for the great educational diversity that makes up all institutions of learning. I would say this quote is really speaking to people who've been teachers for a long period of time and then are coming into IBEST and going, wow, I've trained myself as a teacher to do certain things, to act certain ways, to set up my class in the way that makes sense for me. And now I've got somebody else here and I've got to teach differently, not 100% differently, but differently. And that's going to use my pedagogical muscles in ways that I haven't used them before or haven't used in a long time. If you've ever retrained in sports, like I retrained as running because I taught myself how to run and then I got retrained like the right way to do it. But I was used to the wrong way. The wrong way worked for me until I found out that I was like, wearing down my hip joints or whatever. But I knew how to run, right? And now all of a sudden I didn't know how to run anymore. And it felt clunky and my times were a lot slower. And it actually hurt because I was using my muscles in a different way and all this stuff. Eventually I got where I wanted to go with the retraining and I was better than ever, right? But there was that learning period where it was challenging and I had to act like I didn't know how to run anymore. And it can feel like that if you're used to teaching alone and now you're teaching in IBEST, you're saying, I thought I knew how to teach and now it's like I don't even know how to teach anymore because I'm having to do it with this other person and it can be clunky, which is why it's so important to keep that end goal in mind of like, why are we doing this? We know that the results are there. We're going to get there. It's going to be good. It can take a little bit of time to get there. I think if you're new to teaching, period, and you're doing IBEST, it's a different kind of curve. On the one hand, you don't have to unlearn things that aren't going to work anymore, so that could be a positive. On the other hand, you're kind of learning teaching and team teaching at the same time. And so that's a big challenge. But either way, I think whether you've taught or whether you've not taught before, you can expect IBEST to keep you on your toes. Some basic things that we think are helpful for that are to really set joint responsibility. In other words, we're both equally responsible for the success of the students. We know what our institutional responsibilities are. We're not challenging or changing those, but we're saying, really from the perspective of working with students, we're both responsible for their success. Mutual goal setting. What do you want out of this teaching relationship? What do you want students to get out of this program? Why do you teach? What are you here for? What's your motivation? Doing some of that kind of stuff can be helpful. I think, of course, practicing open communication is key, and we'll talk more about that. I'm going to give you some tips on the Washington way, and you will deviate. You didn't buy this program from me. There were no requirements that said if you don't do it this way, you don't get to do the program anymore. You get to do it however you want. I'm just here to help support you and give you ideas. So one of the packets that you have says Collaborative Planning Part 1. Now would be a good time to flip that open to the first 2 pages, kind of page 1 and 2. To see what you have, the beginnings of a sample syllabus. This is a real syllabus from an IBEST classroom. I don't know where things landed here, how you choose to do syllabi. In Washington State, we advocate that both instructors are listed so that the student has that communication on day 1. There's 2 teachers in the class. And that equality will be reinforced if you're both listed as opposed to not listed. Because then it's like, I'm teacher B and I'm of equal importance, but you won't find me anywhere on the syllabus. That's not really the message that the student will receive without that. You'll notice too in the sample syllabus that it's really, the equality is reinforced because they're side by side. So it's Keith and Eric, and Keith has his goal for the students and Eric has his goal for the students. For example, if you're an ESL teacher, you understand that you're part of that pathway, and so that goal is going to be related to the student passing that class and moving into that career field. But you might have your personal goals as an ESL teacher that have more to do with empowerment or that have more to do with other things about teaching the English language that are important to you. Those don't have to disappear. Those don't have to go away. You can still communicate to the students that that's one of the values that you have as a teacher. It's just going to be in the context of this program. So, we really can't emphasize this enough that you would need to set aside time each week for planning and reflection. IBEST is a big commitment. We don't like to, why pretend, and then I'm going to leave, and then you're going to do it, and you're going to say, hey, he lied to us. He said it wasn't that big of a deal. It's a really big deal. It's a big commitment. It takes a lot of time. So I like to be upfront about that. And from an institutional perspective, yeah, it's a big commitment to say, we're going to do this, and we're going to support this. Because it has bumps along the way. You might even have a whole semester where you feel like you're just trying to get to know each other and the content and how you're going to work together. It takes a little time, and it takes a lot of investment from instructors. And it probably takes more time for faculty than we could ever really compensate, because we can decide, oh, we're going to give you 1 hour a week of planning time, and you're going to say, well, you know what, it took 3. I can't solve that for you. All I can say is that I think institutions need to take a serious look at what it takes to plan in an IBEST, and that they need to take, where they can, that compensation seriously. And instructors really need to be advocate and vocal about the amount of time that it takes to do that work and to do it well, so that people who are making decisions know. So all that should be considered. Setting aside time each week for planning and reflection. Now that's not always face-to-face. My co-teacher and I, it would be like I'm driving home on my commute and I'm saying, well, so-and-so didn't get their homework assignment in, and we only got 3/4 of the way through. Because if you're doing a 50% overlap, who's doing a 50% overlap where the team teacher's only there half the time? Or are you doing 100% where you're there all the time? 100%? That's good. So we oftentimes in Washington State only do 50%. But then you're left trying to fill in the blanks for each other when you're not there. So 100%. The positive there is that you always know what's going on, at least in terms of if class happened, you were there. The negative can be with 50%, it can be easier to be really strategic about what you're going to do when you're team teaching. Okay, you're here for an hour, here's how we're going to make the most of that. Sometimes with the 100%, you kind of go, well, how do we always keep that team teaching dynamic? And so that becomes a different challenge to really use that time wisely. But where you can, to plan and reflect, and then coordinate your grading and classroom policies. In my experience, a certain percentage of that's just set by the institution, so instructors aren't just making up all these policies, right? But where there are chances for you to fine-tune a policy, sometimes that's a late assignment policy or something around classroom participation. It's good for the two instructors to have a conversation so you understand what those policies are. You can learn from each other. I had a late assignment policy that was kind of convoluted and complex, which means that I just didn't follow it that well, didn't follow my own policy. My co-teacher had a really simple, elegant one, so I was like, great, I'm taking your late assignment policy from now on. So as you get to know each other, you can adopt and learn things from each other, and that's really great. Of course, in the classroom, being respectful to each other, making room for each other, and always looking for ways to be actively engaged. I think intentionally sitting with a specific group of students can be active engagement, but you just need to think, what does it mean to me, for me to be engaged in the classroom? Try to find what those things are. So to now step back, so that was kind of some general upfront advice on how you might want to set up your syllabus. Now we want to look at outcomes and standards. And if I remember correctly, we are going to have to do some translation work across institutions and states, but I do want to give you the model for how we do it so you can think about what fits your situation the best. I'm going to take a sip of water here and we'll move forward. Also, once again, remember I'm kind of always speaking from that college perspective, and you can just, and that college credit perspective, so kind of tune that out. But you have your college-wide outcomes. Let's say we're at Clark College in Vancouver, Washington. That's where I taught. So you're at Clark College, and Clark College we want all students who graduate from our college to have these abilities or to meet these outcomes. And then you've got all of your workforce programs. So your workforce programs are over here. That says pathway. That could just say program. But that's my farm tech program outcomes. That's my medical assistant program outcomes. That's my business program outcomes. And then at the class level, I've got student learning objectives. You might have different names for them. That doesn't matter. Think program outcomes, or class objectives. Okay? Then you've got content faculty. Those are the faculty who have been hired to teach those outcomes and those objectives. And they're going to do that by giving students assignments and assessing them. I'm coming over to adult education now, to my adult education in my English language acquisition department. And guess what? They have some state standards that they're using, or they have the college and career readiness standards, which is what we use in Washington State. Or at the very least, they probably have some kind of department standards. And those are going to be at the department level or the program level. And then those are going to be articulated down into specific course objectives or outcomes, student learning objectives. And you've got English and math and adult education faculty, and they are teaching with those standards or those outcomes in mind with assignments and assessments. So as you can see, I made it kind of obvious. You've got parallel worlds here. So that first point of interaction, I think, between faculty is understanding what's the structure of the world that you come from. If I'm an English language teacher, I don't necessarily know what the outcomes are in a program or how those outcomes got created or what they mean or what they're for. So I can do some learning. I personally don't start with curriculum, I start with outcomes because I think those are the goals that we're really responsible for. Similarly, if I'm a workforce, if I'm a career tech instructor, I don't necessarily know what goes on in ESL. I don't know what you do with your students all day, right? Do you have outcomes? Do you have standards? What do you teach? I don't know those things. So as you're getting to know each other, understand that you've got probably pretty similar structures across programs. And from that parallel but separate structure, you're able to come together as faculty and say, where do our outcomes connect? Where does what you teach connect with what I teach? And now we're going to team teach it, and we're going to look at how we do our assignments and our assessment together. So we're going to practice a little bit here, identifying a pathway course outcome, analyzing how something that happens in English or in math relates to the pathway, revising as needed. We've selected the right ones and then revising as needed. Let's actually do it together so you can see how this works. So we're going to enter the world of getting somebody ready to work in a business office where they need to be proficient in Windows and Microsoft Office Suite. And pretend you've got a list of like 10 outcomes, and I've just grabbed the first two, and we're really just going to look at the first one together. So this would be true for any program with a set of outcomes. This first outcome says, by the end of this course, students need to be able to create and manage files in a Windows environment, which makes sense. We've all got, anybody have a really clean desktop that's super organized? All of their files are in the right place? I want to look at your computer right now. Kathy, maybe? Okay. Certainly not me. My desktop's always kind of a mess. It's one of those things when I get bored, I clean it, and I'm never bored. But if a student's learning to work in an office environment where it's a shared computer and a lot of different people are using files, they don't have that luxury. They need to learn how to create and manage files in a Windows environment. So that's the first outcome for the class. I'm horrible. It's over there, my little clicker. So the first thing that I'm going to learn as an adult education instructor, as an ESL teacher, or whatever my role is what are you teaching students how to do? And I could try to read the whole textbook start to finish, and at some point I probably do want to get to know that text pretty well. But for starters, I just want to know, what are your outcomes? What are you actually trying to help students achieve? Okay, you need to help students create and manage files in a Windows environment, and I can check with myself, I know what that means, I kind of know what that means, I don't have the first clue what that means, but that's my first check. So what I'm going to do, I jumped ahead just too fast. In adult education, I'm reading this and I'm thinking about it. Create and manage files in a Windows environment. And in this particular case, and this will often be the case, although not always, the outcome is the what. What do students need to be able to do? They need to be able to create and manage files in a Windows environment. I'm in adult education and I'm thinking, okay, how are they going to learn how to do that? How are they going to learn how to do that? The adult ed side of the house oftentimes is more of the how, and the CTE is oftentimes more of the what. Because remember, we tend to assume that students have basic skills. we tend to assume, I'm going to teach students how to create and manage files in a Windows environment, so I'm going to do an overview in class on how to do that. I'm going to give them an assignment, and I'm going to say, let me know if you have any questions, and go complete your assignment. In our ideal world, that's how it would work, right? Because students would just know how to do that, and our jobs would be easy, and we'd go home at night and watch our favorite TV shows. But as an adult education expert, I'm thinking to myself, well, students need to be able to know how to follow a process in order to do that. So I'm going to go to, I just happen to have all my standards memorized, right? As we all do. Kidding. And I know my reading standard. My reading standard here that says analyze how and why individuals, events, and ideas develop and interact over the course of a text. And I know that these are indicators. So when a student can do one of these things, that's an indication to me that they know how to read on this level. And this is the most simple, and this is the most complex. And I'm thinking if I'm teaching students how to prepare for a career, I'm probably going to be a little bit more in the complex space, although I might find that I need to do something that's this basic here. But I've read them, and like I said, I kind of knew them. And I actually should have chosen this one, not this one, but that's OK. They're virtually identical. And what I realized is that, OK, in order for students to create and manage files in a Windows environment, they're going to need to know how to follow precisely a multi-step procedure. Going back to, we think these things are so basic sometimes, right? But do students know always to read every step before beginning the assignment? No. Step one, I'm going in.
In my experience, Will, students, no matter how many times you explain it to them, they have the steps and they go from 1, 2, and they jump to 6.
Yeah.
Expecting the results, and they're like,
I'm going to skip to the end. Yeah. Let's cut out the busy work in the middle.
But I think the answer to my own question is that technology is changing so fast.
Yes.
Talking about under the computer technological point of view, that people are so used to use cell phones. It's just push, click, drag. That's it. Push, click. Ask them for a password.
Yeah.
They have no idea what is their password. And similar in this situation, and talking about the steps and the process.
Yep.
Is when they need to follow the steps.
So we've got to teach students to slow it down and read all the steps. And if 5 bugs you, you don't get to skip it.
The basic.
And we think that's basic, but whether it's basic or not is sort of irrelevant. Students need it, right? It's that making the implicit explicit and saying, I need to teach students how to follow precisely a complex multi-step procedure, which is, in essence, a reading skill, because that's tied to comprehension and knowing what to do with what you've read. Like when math teachers tell me, well, all we're really teaching people to do is how to pay attention, and we call that math. And I'm like, oh, that's what I say when I'm reading. I'm really just teaching people how to pay attention, and I call it reading. So, great. What's happened here? By selecting the standard in adult education that corresponds or sort of explains what needs to happen in the course outcome, I've created what I like to think of as a package, an instructional package for a team teacher. You know what your job is. It's kind of the same one you always had. I know what my job is. I've been teaching reading a long time. It's still that job. But I'm going to teach that reading in a specific way in context to the course outcome. And I can go to my toolkit of reading strategies to say what reading strategies will help students learn how to do this. The final step that I can do, and this is a real big point of emphasis in Washington State, is that I will never change the course outcomes in the CTE program. Those are set. iBest is not about making those easier, making those less, making those go faster. No, the standard is the standard, it's the standard, and that doesn't change. On the adult ed side of the house, I am allowed in Washington State to modify this language so that it makes the most sense possible for the environment. So as I contextualize the standard to the outcome, I'm saying what they're doing is they're following a complex multi-step procedure when performing a technical task. They're not carrying out an experiment, they're not taking measurements, they're not attending to special cases. So I'm just going to clean that up, and now we've got a nice package that looks like that. And if you go to your syllabus in that handout, I think page 3, you can see they've got the list on the left-hand side of the program outcomes, and on the right-hand side, what they called ABE ESL indicators. And they lined that up ahead of time for the whole program. Another way to contextualize that you'll see, if you look at the column on the right-hand side, the ABE ESL indicators, like that first bullet point, where it says demonstrate familiarity with common business software commands and vocabulary. The original standard said demonstrate familiarity with specialized language in a field. So it's very obvious for the adult education instructor to say, well, what is that specialized content? Oh, it's business software commands. And then I'm going to change the standard to say that. This process, if I sit down with my co-teacher before class starts and I learn what their 8 outcomes are or 5 outcomes are, and I'm able to think about which standards in my world will help students learn those, that's a great start to a teaching partnership. It's a great start to a teaching partnership. Sometimes we get stuck in what I would call kind of the curriculum rut of like, well, here's my textbook. If you read my textbook, you'll know what the content of my class is. But that's a pretty daunting task. It's going to take a long time to learn that textbook. B, the outcomes give me a better sense of what students need to actually know and do by the end of a semester. And so that helps me get to know the instructor. And even this can just be a learning point between 2 faculty. I remember sitting down with a co-teacher, and when I asked him for his outcomes, he was like, huh? And I was like, your outcomes, the things that you teach for the class. And he's like, oh, hold on. And he kind of like dug him out. You know, it's like he hadn't really looked at him in a while because he's sort of he knows what he's doing and he doesn't need to look at his outcomes. I'm like, I need to look at your outcomes. So that's a conversation point for me. And then I wanted to share mine and he's like, oh, I didn't know you had any, right? And so that conversation for me got us a lot further than just, yeah, we can look at your textbook, we can look at your readings, but it helps me to really see what we're both on the hook for students. So that's what I encourage people to do. Even if it's not a requirement of the program here, I think starting there conversationally can be a really rich way into finding out what your field of study is all about. So my question to you, one thing we could do is actually grab some course outcomes for all of the paths that are represented here today, all of the CTE programs, look at a couple of those outcomes together, and then think about, just as a group or in small groups, what adult education standards would help to support, explain, break down that outcome. And we can look up some standards online. You can use some that you're familiar with on your own. What do people think would be valuable? And all of the materials that I use, the PowerPoint, the handouts, which again Kenny has copies of, those are all open educational resources, or OER, love my acronyms. And what that means is that you have permission to use them, reuse them, change them, put them into your own PowerPoint slides, whatever, distribute them, whatever. So again, think of these as free public resources that you can use however you see fit. So if any of this material helps you, if you get the PowerPoint, there's an activity that I cut out because we did kind of a slightly shorter training, so I cut one activity out so there will just be one part of the PowerPoint where you'll look at it and you'll say, I don't remember that. It's because I didn't show it to you. So let's say theoretically, and I know that you were just starting this work, but let's say theoretically that you've got all your outcomes and you've got all your indicators and they're all lined up and you've got your syllabus and that's a tidy package. Let's just talk for a few minutes about what it would look like to combine assignments and assessments. And Kathy and I were having a conversation about this on break, and this can really vary program to program. Some programs, the assignment and the assessment is tied to a national standard, an industry certification, something like that. You're not changing that because it came the way it is, and that's that. And that's fine. Nobody needs to change things that can't be changed. However, other times you have assignments that do have flexibility, and that's where an ESL expert might say, you know, what if we tweak the language of this a little bit? Or what if we came up with a different way to meet this requirement? Or what if we added, maybe you've got a rubric and it's got 4 categories, and you say, what if we added a rubric that reflects an ESL standard, and that I think if the students worked on that standard, it would help them meet the other categories as well. So that's what you're looking for, is when and where are there assignments and assessments that you can modify so the ESL and other basic skills content is not just being taught, which is one thing, but also being assessed. And that really completes the loop for me. If we're teaching something, it must be important. If it's important, we should be assessing it to see how students are doing. So when you want to do that work of developing a joint assignment and a joint assessment, let's just start. What I'm about to tell you isn't specific to IBES. This is just a good overview of kind of the process of steps. Because as teachers, to a certain extent, we're all instructional designers, to some extent, whether we think of ourselves that way or not. So what do you want the student to be able to do? It begins with the outcome. What does the student need to know in order to actually do it and do it well? That's your curriculum. So when someone says, well, I have create and manage files in a Windows environment, I'm like, okay, how do you teach students how to do that? That's your curriculum. I want to see that. So they've got an outcome, they've got curriculum, you've maybe delivered that through a presentation, through a lecture, through a small group activity. What activity is actually going to facilitate the learning? Lecture is an activity. It doesn't feel very active necessarily. It's active for the teacher. But whatever that activity is, what activity will facilitate the learning? The activity helps them dive into the curriculum so that they can understand the curriculum so that they can meet the outcome. How do we know that they've met the outcome? That's assessment. What assessments are you offering that allows the student to demonstrate that they can do what you want them to be able to do? And then that fifth point, criteria, is just to what extent? To what extent has the student done this well? Did they just barely meet the requirement, but hey, C's get degrees? Just messing with you. Or have they done it really well and they did stand out, A+, whatever. So I tend to think of criteria as basically like grading. And assessment is much more of a, have you met the outcome? So those are different things, even though they might both be on a rubric. This says andragogy because some people are very firm about pedagogy is for children, and so andragogy is adult learning. I don't care if you use that or not. You can call it anything you want, but that's there if you would like that. I tend to kind of use both terms. So, the cycle of team teaching is the cycle of teaching with the word co in front of it. So, normally you plan your instruction, you teach it. You evaluate how well you think you did, you reflect on what you might change, and you do it again. Co says you do that process together. So you do as much planning as you can ahead of time. People ask how much, I'm like, well, probably as much as you can, because it's usually not enough. So, although you can actually plan a program to death, so don't overplan, but we usually don't find ourselves in that space. You plan it together, you give it a try, you see how it worked, you think what you might do different, and you do it again. And that's how that richness of that teaching team is going to be established, is by going through that process. My encouragement simply is to be intentional about these steps. Don't skip this step. Take time. And that's a chance for you to be honest with each other. How well do you think we did? Where did we struggle? What could we do different? So don't shortchange these steps and just do these two, or just this. You really want all of them. And so you might think about how you build that in. I think just intentional scheduling can be your best friend here. To say, even before the semester starts, picking that date, or at least that week, that says, okay, a week after the end of the semester, we're going to sit down and reflect on what we might want to do different next time. Something like that. Be intentional about that scheduling. In my experience, if we aren't intentional about it, it doesn't happen. Because it's the end of the semester, it gets busy, you want to go on vacation, whatever else. But plan that time for when you're going to have a debrief for what went well and what didn't. Or what could be improved, West Coast, right? So some other things to do as you're establishing your teaching relationship. This slide is sort of just like a friendly reminder. Just talk, what do you most enjoy doing in the classroom? What do you least enjoy doing in the classroom? Oh, grading, me too. Oftentimes is the answer. But get to know each other. Where possible, you might even try getting to know each other as human beings and not just as colleagues. So maybe you meet off-site. Maybe you meet at somebody's house. Maybe you go out for happy hour, or you do something to try to bond on something that's other than just content. I find teachers are usually pretty cool people, and so getting to know each other might actually be fun. So, in a nutshell then, and once again, once I've demoed this for you, if you just want to go back to what you were doing, because that's where you were, great, but now you've seen the process. Once we have a combined outcome and standard, theoretically, so let's look at this together. Create and manage files in a Windows environment, right? That was our outcome. College and career readiness standard. Follow precisely a complex multi-step procedure when performing a technical task. We really don't need the rest of that. Okay, great. So the question would be, how do we give an assignment and an assessment that addresses all of those things? Well, one thing we don't have is that the instructor has given a hierarchy for how they want people to organize their folders. So we don't have that piece of paper with us today. But the students have read that, and they know their assignment. And let's take a look at the rubric, which is, are they meeting the outcome in the criteria? If you wanted to, you could say 4 excellent, 3 good, 2 fair, that kind of stuff. This is just an example. Okay, folder names are spelled correctly and match the model, 4 points. The hierarchy matches the model, 4 points. The folder sequencing is in the right number order, 4 points. You took a picture of it and uploaded it to Canvas, 3 points. In here, if I've done this assignment, I will have demonstrated that I know how to create and manage files in a Windows environment, so I've met the outcome. And I will have indeed followed precisely a complex multi-step procedure. I followed the model, I followed the model, I followed the model, I did the steps. So when we assess this, we're able to assess both the outcome and the standard. Remember, when you're bringing in an adult education standard, if it truly makes sense for the outcome, it will be pretty obvious that you're assessing it at the same time, because the student will have to have met this in order to meet this. So they should be related in that way. Here's another example, a little hairier, lots of writing, but I'll break it down for you. This is a writing rubric. You've got 4 categories: introduction and conclusion, observation, tools and process, analysis, interpretation, and conclusion. This is like the written conclusion. This is like the thinking conclusion. And professional qualities like spelling, grammar, formatting stuff. And then you have your 0 to 17 points, emerging, 18 to 22 points, meets, 23 to 25 points, exceeds. I'm imagining those categories. And I've got a teaching team, and this is an early childhood education classroom. Well, observation, tools, and process, and analysis, interpretation, and conclusion are very content heavy. That's really about the content of early childhood education. So wouldn't you know it, that instructor assesses these 2 categories. So picture a stack of papers, but not everybody's. You didn't split the stack in half because you don't have equal expertise, right? You can't both assess the papers the same. But the ECE instructor says, I don't need to observe how good my students are at writing introductions and conclusions because I don't really teach that skill. And I don't really have to focus on the professional qualities of grammar and spelling and if it's been typed because I don't have to teach that skill either. My basic skills instructor taught those skills. They taught the basics of writing, fundamentals of writing for this essay, and they taught some of those professional qualities. So instructor A assesses these. Instructor B assesses these. They both have access to Canvas. They can both get in there and do their assessment. So that's another way to think about, as you're building your assignments, think about how you want to build your assessments. Now, there's some assignments. I am remembering in particular our end of quarter assignment, which was the big one. We sat down and we assessed those together at an end of quarter party. Party, you're working. But it was a chance for us to have that final conversation about student work. How did they do? What are we noticing here? And to resolve those differences. If I thought this was a really good paper, like, I actually don't think it was that great, and we can kind of talk about why. So that was some good conversation. But for other assignments during the quarter, there's no need for us to collaborate on all of them. If you know your parts and I know my parts. Other times you can just wholly say, hey, do you want to take discussion post grading for this week? Pretty simple. I kind of know what I'm looking for. I don't need to be your content expert. So I think the balance of assignments and assessments and who does what can really depend on the teaching team, on what the comfort level is. Certainly in a content area where there's a lot of safety requirements, industry requirements, you want to be really careful about assessment and not be giving your ESL instructor work to assess that's sort of outside of the purview of what you need for your program to maintain its high standards. But make sure you're looking for those places where the ESL gets to assess too. Maybe there are things that you have assessed in the past, content instructor, but you don't need to assess in the future. Because, hey, I did spend time assessing these, but it's great that I have a co-teacher who can take that on because they took on the bulk of the instruction for it and they're going to take on the bulk of the assessment for it too. So that was just an entry point to say that if you were done with all of your outcome integration and syllabus work, you could move on to this. I suspect most of you will want to return back to the planning that you were doing before I so rudely interrupted you, but that'll be your choice. To be thinking that the other half of the conversation is really assignments and assessments in the classroom. I think to a certain extent, the planning you do is about what both people need. And different people or different teaching teams might need different levels of pre-planning. And it also might be one of those situations where you have somebody who is a pretty hardcore planner and somebody who isn't. And so you'll have to just sort of navigate that difference. I'm not a planner type, and so my planner types, I make them nervous. Well, what are you going to do? I'm like, I'll figure it out. It'll be fine. That's not good enough for me. So you've got to relieve the planner types and let them know what you're doing, right? My planner types sometimes will have to learn in IBEST to let go of a few things and say, we're going to try this in class, and we don't know how it will go, and that's okay, right? So, but again, it's about the two of you, and it's about saying, what do we need to feel comfortable with each other, to feel like our program's working, and I don't think that's one size fits all. So these are recommendations. I think some of you want to put down a weekly schedule and get it all laid out, and that's great. Others might say, we're a little more freeform than that, and I think that can be okay both ways.
No wonder Doreen and you got along so well.
Hmm?
No wonder you and Doreen got along so well.
The non-planning,
Oh,
yeah.
God.
It's all in here. I just can't explain it to anybody.
Yeah, that's Doreen.
I can explain it to myself. So what we want to do to end the day, so this has been a really successful day, so thanks so much for your time, is these are just a few little tips. We just polled some of our teaching teams who'd been doing it a long time and said, what would you tell people who were new to IBEST about team teaching? So these should resonate with those who have done it before. Golden rule, never take anything for granted. Explicitly discuss everything. Well, you don't always know what you don't know until you don't know it. So, but the things that you do know, talk about them. Clear communication on the part of both team members is essential. Establish a procedure for discussing potential conflicts. I say do that while you both still really like each other and be like, hey, Kathy, things are looking great right now. I bet somewhere in between week 3 and week 8 we'll disagree on something. So when that happens, how do we want to handle that? That'd be a great conversation to have. Let's see, talking through each step of the lesson will help define individual roles. That's where you say it's not just about saying, well, today we're going to do this thing. Okay, well, what does that thing look like? How are we going to break that down? Does that take about 30 minutes? Who's going to do what? Do you want me to stand at the board while you're talking? Is it okay if I do the collaborative model, or will you feel like I'm interrupting you, right? Those kinds of things. Honest discussions, clear up potential misunderstandings. This was an interesting one. Decide on what type of behavior is not acceptable in your class and consequences for disruptions, because you might just find that you have different classroom management preferences or techniques, and you don't have to be the same, but it might not be a bad idea to find out where you're at so you can see how much you're on the same page. And the pre-planned response came about because it turned out sometimes that students would try teacher A and get an answer, and then try teacher B. Best if they get the same answer. So it's good for the biggies to have that pre-planned. Like, you know how you're going to respond to cell phone use because you decided ahead of time that that was going to be, right? If it's a more unique situation, a student asks you a question, you go, gosh, that's a great question. The right answer is, I'm going to go check with my co-teacher and get back to you, as opposed to giving them an answer and then finding out later that they already talked to your co-teacher, right? So pre-planning that, and it's not against the students, they're just trying to get their needs met, right? But they're going to get what they can get. So you want to make sure you're on the same page. I'm told this is like parenting.
Yeah, I'm dad.
Yeah, you're a dad.
I'm the dad.
And you might, yeah,
all the good
and students can play that relationship. So you'll want to kind of watch out for that in a good way. Determine how both an in-class, out-of-class assessment will work. Again, don't assume that teacher A or teacher B is doing all the assessment for any particular thing. Talk about it. Who's doing what? Again, analyze your individual strengths and abilities and determine how they can be used within the team context. How does your unique personality type, what can you gain from that? Both partners should take active parts on every stage of the lesson. Define what does active look like to you? Let's talk about what active means, because it doesn't necessarily have to be you're both talking, but what are you both doing? Setting goals and learning outcomes for each lesson and course. I think that might just be more of a good teaching practice, not necessarily just for team teaching, to let students know, here's what we're going to do today. Here's what we're hoping to get out of today. Plan lessons according to an agreed upon timetable. Where planning really, I've changed and I'm more on the side of planning than I used to be, is it's really about honoring your colleagues' time by saying, here's the time that we set up to do that, let's honor that and use that time. Plan transitions, timing, and pacing. So when you're actually in the classroom, develop a system of signaling each other. Those can be subtle, they can be not subtle, they can make the students laugh as you gesture to each other. Students will get into your teaching partnership and they'll have fun with it, and so you can have fun with it too. So if someone starts to wander and you have to do this, whatever it might be. For me, I find eye contact is really key when I'm co-working with somebody to just like, are we good? Are we cool? Are you freaked out? Did I do something? You know, you're just kind of making that eye contact. Oh, there it is again. They must really like that. Maintain eye contact with each other to signal transitions to new activities, modifications, or activity closings. Sometimes I forget what we were supposed to do next, and I look at my co-teacher with that pleading look of, please say something, anything, to save me right now, right? And then they give the same look back, and then you know you're kind of hosed, but you know. Then you give the students a 3-minute writing assignment, and then you huddle in the corner and figure out what you're doing, which the students will roll with that just fine. Develop a mutually agreed upon backup plan. What happens when things don't go? Having a plan B, sometimes even a plan C.
Sometimes I'm explaining, I'm lecturing, and I'm reaching the peak of the explanation part, and one student is like, they say, yes, question. And
It's gone.
And I'm going blank. I'm answering the question, then I'm like, then I look at him like, I feel like, help with my eyes.
Yes,
He's
please.
like, okay. And then he's like, yes, do you have something to say? Because, you
Then
know.
I rescue him.
Yeah, you offer a breadcrumb to get back on the trail, right? Like, oh, that's where it is. Thank you so much. Good.
Oh my God.
A perfect example of how a teaching relationship can evolve, and not necessarily be any of the models. Sometimes that's just good human interaction that you have between the two of you, which I think is great. Using that classroom space, I really think that one of the cool things about IBEST, one of those more, again, kind of subtle human things, not this like crazy big pedagogy thing, is just it increases the energy level in the room, and I think you can circulate to really use that to your advantage. And then always, always, always show respect for one another, both inside and outside the classroom. I'm told this is like parenting as well. If not always for your sake, then for the sake of the students. Because if they feel like you don't respect each other, you've kind of lost the moment in the classroom. So when you have to work out differences, find places to do that, but do it within a context of respect. There is my contact information, so wdurden@sbctc.edu. Feel free to write that down should you ever have any questions. Of course, you've got Kenny as your contact, and I can certainly interface with Kenny on any and all requests you have, but you're always welcome to contact me directly if you would like to. This went pretty fast, 4 hours, nice work. Thanks, Kenny, for the supply of food to keep things going. I think that always helps. Do you have any questions or thoughts in closing? Is there anything else that we need to cover? Thank you, you're welcome. Yeah, thank you. It's been a really great 4 hours. As always, like I said at the beginning, we wouldn't do it if it doesn't work, but it really does work, and so it really is worth the time. And I just want to thank you all, both those of you who've been doing it from the beginning to those of you who are just jumping in, for your commitment to it. It's really cool how it changes student lives.